I've been saying for years that the government is broke. Today, we look at just how broke with the publication of what's called the Whole of Government Accounts for the year ended March 2021. In these accounts, income means only one thing: how much tax they've shaken you and I down for in the previous tax year. It was actually down on the previous year from 813 billion in 2020 to 731 billion in 2021. Presumably that's the impact of banana syndrome on VAT, corporation tax, and income tax. Expenditure had already been increasing by 40 or 50 billion a year since 2016, but in 2021, again, presumably due to pandemic handouts, it shot up by 145 billion to stand at 1.03 trillion pounds. Taking a view across the last 5 years, the gap between income and expenditure is 577 billion pounds to be added to the red ink already on the UK balance sheet. Total assets have remained eerily steady at around the 2 trillion mark during the half-decade, while liabilities have steadily risen from 4.3 to 5.5 trillion. What I find remarkable looking across the years since 2016 is how the total tax take has remained really consistent around 700 to 800 billion pounds a year. The first thing this confirms is that our economy is not growing, otherwise there'd be more corporation tax, more income tax, more VAT and so on being paid. But we do know that the tax burden has increased due to fiscal drag and inflation. So my second conclusion is that a smaller number of people must now be paying a larger amount of tax. So if revenue has remained flat, where are the costs increasing that are adding up to this ever-widening budget deficit? The first area is staffing. Our ever-increasing army of civil servants, bureaucrats, and regulators represent about the only growth sector left in the British economy. In 2016, the annual wage bill was a mere £191 billion. By 2021, that had risen to £250 billion, a 33% increase. Did you notice the service you receive from government departments becoming 33% better? Me neither. The other big hike is in grants and subsidies, a near 400% increase from 53 billion to just under 200 billion. I'm leaving out the odd figures after the decimal point because 500 million here and there doesn't even move the dial at these levels. The asset column of the balance sheet makes interesting reading. 1.2 trillion pounds is held in property, which includes not just government buildings, but the entire road and rail networks, potholes and all. Financial assets include the 1/3 holding in the disgraced NatWest Bank, as well as the entire student loan portfolio for all those media studies graduates now working at Starbucks. To paraphrase the Eerily brothers, ask your parents, it's so hard to see good loans go bad. On the liability side, red ink outweighs black by a factor of 250%. The biggest hole being those gold-plated public sector pensions. You and I will be forking over 2.3 trillion pounds for the existing not-so-civil servants, and that's before all those new recruits start qualifying for the golden handcuffs. At the time of these accounts, government debt amounted to 1.2 trillion pounds, but I suspect that figure is much higher today. In an auction of government bonds just last week, they had to offer over 5% to find a buyer. Interest costs are already forecast to be well over 100 billion pounds this year, so get ready for a big hike in the interest costs in 23-24. In this woke world, you've got to be very careful what you laugh at, but thank heavens there will always be forecasts from the Office for Budget Irresponsibility. In the latest whole of government accounts, they anticipate inflation, which peaked at 11.1% in October 2022, would fall back to just 2.9% in the fourth quarter of this year. They sent me some special stuff to take when reading their forecast, so excuse me while I take a drag. Oh, it's better. Now I'm starting to see how rosy everything looks. Wait a minute, there's a big pink creature just flying past my window. They do at least acknowledge the slippery slope we are on. I quote directly from the accounts. Public sector net debt reached 99.2% of GDP in 2022-23, the highest level since the 1960s. And in the OBR's March 2023 forecast, it's expected to peak at 103.1% of GDP in 2023-24. Debt has risen over recent decades as a result of external shocks such as the global financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the energy crisis. These shocks have had material impacts on the economy and led to higher borrowing to fund additional support for households and businesses. What they don't mention is that the $376 billion of higher borrowing to fund additional support for households and businesses was entirely because of the insane policy of lockdowns that the government insisted on. They also failed to point out that when you massively increase the money supply at the same time as shutting down the economy and its supply chains, when everything opens up again, you are guaranteed to see rip-roaring inflation. So we are now seeing the normalization of interest rates as a response to inflation, resulting in painfully high debt servicing costs for the government, for business, and for households. Did you know that we now have a charter for budget responsibility with a goal to reduce public sector net debt to 3% of GDP by 2027? Given that we'll be well into a Labour Parliament by that time, any thoughts of budget responsibility will have been kicked into the long grass. You have to delve 66 pages into this doorstop of a report to see some of the scariest figures. There are four main pension schemes that account for 80% of the 2.3 trillion liability. In the 12 months of this accounting period, the scale of liabilities in the NHS scheme increased by 104 billion, the cost of teachers' pensions increased by just under 50 billion, civil servants by 27 billion, and the armed forces by 24 billion. So in the same year that all the income tax paid by every one of us added up to 191 billion, pension commitments to existing public sector workers increased by more than 200 billion. Remind me how you spell unsustainable? The report points out the fragile nature of the country's finances in regard to these pensions. I quote, "These four schemes are unfunded, defined benefit occupational pension schemes. The pay-as-you-go nature of these schemes means that pension contributions of today's employees and employers are used to offset payments to current pensions. Future payments will be funded by future contributions and tax receipts. The income received in the NHS pension scheme currently exceeds payments being made, so the balance of that surplus cash is returned to the Treasury under arrangements governed by the legislation. The income in the civil service, teachers, and armed forces pension schemes is insufficient to pay all the currently paid pensions, so the balance of that funding is provided by Parliament. So we are already subsidizing these pensions and will be for decades to come. As we grow the civil service to administer ever-increasing regulations, and we grow the NHS to support an aging population, someone needs to explain to me how the sums are going to add up. Our national debt is more than 100% of GDP. The country's balance sheet is in the red to the tune of 3.5 trillion, and our annual budget is running at a deficit of 332 billion. If you and I ran our businesses like this, we'd be in jail by this point. In simple maths, we'd have to double the income tax take to balance the books. With many middle-class workers already being drawn into the 40% tax band thanks to fiscal drag, that would imply 40% becomes the basic rate, and those on higher incomes would return to the 95% tax rates that the Beatles sang about in the 1960s. I suspect that will be politically unpalatable in the 2020s, so get ready for a whole new approach to wealth redistribution under Labour. The favourites have to be either a mansion tax on property above a certain value or a wealth tax on your entire net worth. If you're happy to be a hostage to fiscal fortune, I wish you luck. If you feel that you'd rather hang on to your money than let the government decide how to spend it, let our experts help you look at your options for a plan B in a country where you might just be more welcome. I'll see you next time.